All right, guys. Starting our fifth lesson of the series on evolution in the Bible. Dealing with the question: do science and the Bible work together? This week we are going to be talking about ancient man and just some of the evidence for ancient man, how it works with what we find in the Bible and creation science. Of course, we'll be dealing with what evolution says about it and looking at both sides of the coin here. So, just want to jump right in here and really talk about it a lot. Obviously, everything that we know about ancient man is based on the fossils or the remains that we find. Some of them are fossilized, some are just remains that we find. And so, when we start talking about ancient man, like the first humans, what is it that you guys think of? What's our idea of early humans? Well, most of us are going to say that our idea of early humans is going to be something along the lines of this: cavemen. So we all have that idea in our head of what cavemen are, whether we've watched the Flintstones or seen the movie The Croods, or any number of things that it could have been based on. We have an idea of what cavemen were like, and so that idea usually comes along the lines of they were knuckle dragging, club carrying, that they were very ape-like. That's kind of where the knuckle dragging thing comes from, but a lot of pictures make them look very much like monkeys. And then that they were very stupid. Now, obviously, this idea, all of these come very much from the idea of evolution that says that we evolved from monkeys, and so these are a lot of things that tend to be associated with monkeys. If you're thinking of early humans having just recently evolved from monkeys, they would have had a lot of the same attributes, wouldn't have been as intelligent, all of that. And so we'll get more into that in a little bit later. But the question is, does this idea that we have in our heads match that of a biblical model for what early man would have been like? Well, the answer is no. In fact, pre-flood man was incredibly intelligent. And we know this because if you take a look in your Bibles, and you can pause and flip over there if you want, but if you take a look in your Bibles to Genesis 4, verses 19 through 22, we're going to find an obscure little verse here that talks just a little bit about ancient man. And ancient man, let's look at this description here that we find here. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raised livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. All right, so these are some of the earliest humans that lived. This is not that far after Adam and Eve. During this time, Adam and Eve probably would have still been alive, or have recently died right around this time. So these were some of the first humans that ever lived, and we get a couple descriptions of them here. First, we get Jabal, and what we know about him is that he raised livestock. His family lived in tents and raised livestock, which means farming is something that requires a little bit more skill, a little more than the whole caveman intelligence that we come to understand. That it would take to actually raise livestock for food like he would have, and to live in tents. Notice he also didn't live in a cave. He lived in tents. His brother, who is creatively named by changing just one letter from Jabal to Jubal, we know that he was the father of all stringed instruments and of pipes. So we can thank him for instruments and music. It seems that he would have been the origin of all of these. In fact, I believe his name actually is the origin of the word Jubilee, Jubal. And so we can take a look at that, and that takes a lot of intelligence for somebody to design musical instruments. I wouldn't really know how to design an instrument that actually sounded good, but it takes a lot of intelligence to not just form instruments, but to compose and to actually play those instruments. And so he was the father of that. And then we get to Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain, much like in this picture that you see here, he forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron, so he would have been a blacksmith, and that is something that would have taken a lot of talent and skill for sure to forge metal into different items and tools. Definitely, again, not something that they were making fire out of rocks or just barely trying to invent the wheel. This was something that they were an advanced society, able to create blacksmithed items that were forged out in fire. Very complicated items, in fact. Now, do we have any evidence for this? Well, actually, we have a little bit of evidence. Yeah, I'm going to show you this video that Kate actually sent me right before I started prepping this lesson. That worked very well for this lesson, in fact, from TikTok. But it's going over some evidence that we have found here.
In 1948, Frank Kennard testified that in 1912, while working in the municipal electric plant in Thomas, Oklahoma, broke open an unusually large piece of coal only to find an iron pot. An iron pot? Coal is 300 million years old, right? Or was this iron pot created by Tubal-Cain?
By Tubal-Cain. So we've got this... we have here Tubal-Cain who created all kinds of bronze and iron, and so potential. We talked about coal in the previous lessons, and we know that coal was formed during the flood. So anything that is found in coal, it stands to reason that it was created pre-flood. Now, again, they're going to tell you that coal is 300 million years old and that humans did not live during the time that coal would have been formed. Well, it seems that this indicates otherwise. If this is indeed a real piece of evidence, it seems that had to have been made by somebody. And so that would have been a likely candidate for that would have been someone like Tubal-Cain, who we know was pre-flood, working in the as a blacksmith, or one of his apprentices, or somebody who followed in his footsteps pre the flood, likely made this iron pot. And so again, this shows some kind of intelligence that was there, and it's also significant evidence for the fact that people, one, existed earlier than evolutionists say they did, and two, were much smarter than evolutionists tend to say that they are. And so this is what we would call a OOP art, an out-of-place artifact, and we've talked about that briefly in another lesson, but an OOP art is essentially anything that is out of place at the evolutionary timeline that doesn't fit right. So oftentimes OOP arts are pretty quickly buried by evolutionists because they don't fit the narrative that they're looking for. But this would be an instance of that. Now, we talked briefly about this a minute ago, but evolution says that we came from apes, right? And so we came from monkeys who slowly evolved over time. Now, the question is, why is it that they say monkeys? Well, on one hand, it's pretty obvious because we look a lot like monkeys, except just less hairy versions of monkeys. Now, some of us look more like monkeys than others, but we do look a lot like monkeys, and they have a lot of similar traits. They are relatively intelligent creatures, and so this idea that over time enough changes came from one species to turn into an entirely different species that evolution has, it stands to reason that monkeys would be the creature that we came from. And so there's a little bit of just guesswork there that they assume that that's where we must have come from. But in addition to that, as they then went from that guesswork of saying, hey, we look like monkeys, we must have come from monkeys, they did some research in genetics, and they have found that we actually share 98% of our DNA with monkeys. 98%. Now, that sounds like a whole lot, and it certainly is, and that would seem to be pretty compelling evidence. In fact, Kate and I were at the zoo the other day, and we were looking at the chimpanzees, and some guy was telling us, hey, those are your closest living relatives, genetically speaking, that they are 98% the same as you. And so that's a pretty commonly stated fact. But is that actually significant? Let's take a look at that. Well, as it turns out, you actually share DNA with a lot of things, not all of which do you look alike and or act alike. And so we're going to take a look at this next screen here and play a little game of whose DNA do we share. Well, let's take a look at this screen and see whose DNA it is. You can take guesses as if you want to pause it and take a look. We share DNA with some of the things on this screen here. Let's take a look at the mouse. It turns out we share 85% of our DNA with a mouse. In the same way, looks like we also share 70% of our DNA with a slug. Let's bump on up to the octopus here and see if we share anything with him. No, actually, we do not. We don't share any DNA with octopus, so how about we bump over the cat? 90% of our DNA is shared with a cat. Interesting. Actually, the specific breed of cat that you find there in that picture is the one that they say we share 90% of our DNA with. 60% of our DNA is shared with a fly. Uh, Rooster, 60% is also shared with a chicken. Cows, we share 80% of our DNA. And surely, just like the octopus, we do not share any DNA with bananas. But let's take a look, and 60% of our DNA, over half, is shared with bananas. So really, the only thing on here that we don't share DNA with is the octopus. Now, as I was doing research, I was anticipating actually having several things on here that we didn't share DNA with, and I found that it was actually quite difficult to find creatures that we did not share DNA with. And octopus was one of the only ones. In fact, it's one of the reasons that scientists think octopuses are so odd, and some people even theorize that they were dropped off by aliens or are themselves aliens. Um, but regardless of that fact, the point is that we share DNA with quite a few things, many of which I don't believe we evolved from. I don't think we evolved from bananas, right? Um, stuff like a cat or a mouse might fit into the evolutionary timeline a little bit. Birds don't really; they came from dinosaurs. That's not really in our line. They'd be cousins in the evolutionary line, but not much else. So why is it that we share? Well, I'll give you some examples. I won't go through every one of them, but for example, with a banana, when it says that we share DNA, what that means is there's very similar DNA that serves the same purpose. So with a banana, the genes that the banana contains help divide cells or replicate cells, and that's something that we need in our body to be able to divide and replicate our cells, so that they keep forming, so that we stay healthy and young, and that our cells are able to duplicate themselves. So that's going to be found in bananas. In the same way, with the chicken, we share genes that are helpful for bone calcification, so the hardening of your bones, making sure that your bones can heal, making sure that they stay healthy and strong. In the same way with a fruit fly, we share genes that are necessary for growth and development, as well as genes that cause diseases. So that's why fruit flies can actually cause a lot of our diseases, and they're very disease-carrying creatures because we share a lot of those same genes. Mice, we share a lot of the genes as well, for development and immune responses, which is why mice are used to test out a lot of vaccines and viruses and see if it'll kill a mouse, or if it'll heal a mouse, then it likely will not hurt us. Or it will hurt us, as the case may be. So the point is that we share a lot of DNA. So now, why is this? Well, let me put it this way. If I'm creating a car, every car that I make, I don't have to reinvent the gas tank, right? I know that I've got a tank that works. I might have to readjust how it is that it fits into the car. The shape might have to change, the size might have to change, but all in all, in the end, I've got a gas tank, right? Mazda is not going to have some random other invention that's not a gas tank than Ford. No, they're both going to use gas tanks. The reason is when you get a good design, you use it multiple times. In the same way, as a creator, God, as He makes these things, we're going to see some repeat patterns that are used in His creation. They're not all going to look completely unique from each other. And in the same way, DNA is going to be the same way. It is essentially a blueprint for how the bodies are going to run. So, for living things, we're going to have a lot of the same features that that other ones, even if they don't look like us. And so that's where we have monkeys come in, that we share that DNA. So it's apparently not as significant as you might have thought, that we share DNA with a monkey. They do also, I will say, they do also think that monkeys are the reason that we were stupid. Remember, we evolved from them. They're not as smart. There's actually quite a bit of racist theories that came in early evolution about the brain size of a monkey indicated that we were, and the brain sizes found in early human skulls that they would have held indicate that the smaller brain must have been dumber, and then that was then correlated to African Americans, who they said also had lighter brains, which must have made them dumber and less evolved than Europeans. Incredibly racist. You can actually find papers if you Google it on the comparison of as they say, on the comparison of the Negro brain with the orangutan brain. horribly racist things that were said, and this is all from this idea that we evolved from monkeys. So, moving on, all the human fossils that we find, funny enough, are not from the flood. They, unlike everything else in the fossil record that we have, we don't seem to have any human fossils. Very odd. That would seem to fit in with an evolutionary timeline. So why would this be? Well, most of the fossils that we have are either sea creatures or reptiles or amphibians. There's not many mammal fossils found at all. Humans are mammals. And so why is this? Well, sea creatures make sense because the flood would have come from the ocean, would have washed a bunch of sea creatures up, killed a bunch of those. That makes sense. Also, reptiles and amphibians tend to live near the coasts, and so they would have been some of the first things that were killed. And they're also tend to be rather oblivious to what's going on, whereas mammals, if there's like an earthquake or tsunami, you'll notice that pets freak out and they run for the hills, and it's because they know that something bad is happening. They're very aware of their surroundings when natural disasters take place. In the same way, because this is early on in Earth's history, there would not have been as many humans as there are today. So there would have been less human fossils to find and more animal fossils. So we don't have that. But the main reason is if you are is that awareness. If you are outside and you see the floodwaters rising, you're not going to just stand there and go, "Oh no, I'm going to drown." No, you're going to find shelter. You're going to find something that floats. You're going to find a tree to climb. You're going to find a mountain to get up on top of. Whatever it is, you're going to find some shelter. And so that's what you see in this picture is all the creatures that are fleeing from the floodwaters rising with the ark in the background there as they search for a way uh, to escape these floodwaters. And so that means that mammals and humans would have been some of the last creatures to die from the flood. Now, why is this significant? Well, remember, as they died, they would have been fossilized, and as fossilization happened, it would have layered. So the first things to die would have been fossilized on the bottom, the last things on the top. Okay. So why is this significant? Well, when the floodwaters washed back out to sea, when they dried up, remember they eroded the earth away. And so we get things like the Grand Canyon and mountains and valleys that are all eroded away from the earth as this water pulls back and rips through all this stone. Well, the top layer of fossilization would have been the first thing that would have been eroded by the floodwaters. So much of the remains of humans would have been eroded into the ocean and destroyed, which means that I'm not saying that there aren't any human remains pre-flood that are in existence, but it's a big earth and it's hard to find something when there's not many of them out there. So, most flood fossils or remains we find of humans are instead found from the Ice Age when it comes to early humans. And so, there's a number of different types that are worth looking at. I'm going to focus on just a few. But before we go into that, I want to define a little bit of terms here for you. So, we've got two different types of human fossils according to evolution. You've got hominids and Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is the term for human. So the human ones, early ones, you'll often see them referred to just as Homo. Those are the ape-like humans. All right, so the ape-like humans with ape traits because they were the early humans, some of the first to evolve from apes. Then you have the hominids, which are the human-like apes. So they are the apes with human traits. They walk upright. They have more human, less body hair. That they seem to be more human, but they are monkeys themselves. And so everybody's looking for that missing link that's between the two. That transitional fossil where it was half ape, half human. And what is that transitional fossil? So this is the narrative that we're looking at. These are the kinds of fossils. But before we go on, I want to play a game with you. And since you are watching, just feel free to pause. But I'm going to show you a bunch of quotes. We're going to act as if we're archaeologists here. And I'm going to show you a bunch of quotes from a book, about 15 quotes. And what I want you to do is I want you to read these quotes and determine information about the book based on the quotes. Now, seems to be, I'll give you a little bit of information. It seems to be that these quotes are from an autobiography. So that's a book written about somebody's life by the person who lived it. So if I wrote a book on my life, that would be an autobiography. And they are usually written about historically significant figures who did something important. So I want you to read these quotes. Feel free to pause as you read, back it up, whatever you need to do. They're about 15 quotes. I'll slowly scroll through them here. And I want you to read them, and I want you to determine what those quotes tell me, what kind of who you think the book might have been about, or what you think that person might have done. If you don't know the exact person that it might have been about, tell me if you think what gender you think they were, they male or female. Just tell me these details. Figure out what these details are, and then we're gonna take a look at that, and you can kind of just see if you were right. So remember, seems to be an autobiography. Just take a look here, and I'm going to scroll through these. Okay, that is the last quote. So feel free to back it up, scroll around, whatever you want to do. And I'll do a countdown, and then I'll switch over to reveal what the book is. But make sure you have your prediction in mind beforehand. So I'm going to do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now I lied to you. You're probably realizing I told you it was an autobiography. That was not true. It is, in fact, all of these are from the Hunger Games book. Most of you will be familiar with that book. If you haven't read it, you probably have seen the movies. But all of these are direct quotes from the Hunger Games. Now, what did I do? Why did I not tell you the truth? I said it was probably from an autobiography because I wanted you to be thinking it was a person that was real. I wanted you to be figuring out what it was what they did, who they might be. I wanted you to have a story that you were basing all of your information off of. That little snippet that this might have been an autobiography, but it's true. I also, all these quotes were themed. They all tended to be themed around cooking or hunting or survival, something along those lines. So you probably were taking a look at thinking that they were some survivalist or cook or something like that. Some, maybe Davy Crockett, something along those lines that was a survivalist who lived and did all these kinds of things. So there's a theme to them. So why is it that you got the information answer wrong? I'm assuming that you probably did not guess it was the Hunger Games. Excuse me. And the reason for that is because why? Well, you didn't have enough information. You had 15 short quotes out of an entire book, right? 15 quotes out of a book is not enough to determine really what the book is, especially when they aren't plotline quotes and they are likely to and they all had a theme to them as well, and so they're gonna look a lot like they were a survivalist or cooking book or something, whatever it was that you thought them to be. Now, why is this? Because you didn't have the information you needed. What did you have to do to answer the questions that I asked you? You had to fill in the gaps with your imagination, with your understanding of what you saw and what I had told you that it was an autobiography. That was information you'd been given. Excuse me. And so you had to take a look at um, the information you were given and imagine and fill in those gaps. Now remember, those are gaps that are filled in by your imagination. So why is this important? Well, what I want you to see from this illustration is the less information you have, the more you have to rely on your imagination and the narrative you've been given to fill in the gaps of that information. Okay, so hold on to that moral. We're going to go on and take a look. Now we're going to start looking at some actual fossils here. First one we're going to look at is one of the most famous, and it's Lucy. It's why we're starting with her. Lucy is a hominid fossil. Remember, that is a human-like ape. And so Lucy is one of the most famous ones that have ever been found. She's considered to be a missing link, and she is a favorite fossil of evolutionists to prove that humans evolved from apes. And so the thing about Lucy is only about 30% of her skeleton has been found. That's actually 47 out of the 207 bones in her body. So all those white bones are the bones they did not find. All the dark ones are the ones they actually found. So very little of her has actually been found. But that's what we have. We have one hip, we have one knee, we've got, a few pieces of the skull, a few pieces of the ribs, a few pieces of the arms, one vertebrae of the spine. Like, that's it. That's not much. So why is Lucy significant? Well, one reason she's significant is because her hip bone indicates that she can walk upright. It seems to be shaped like a human's hip there, and so the human's hip joint allows you to walk upright rather than hunched over like an ape would. Also, her knee is shaped like a human's, which is important for walking upright as well. And so these assumptions were drawn actually from these footprints that were fossilized in Tanzania about 1,000 miles from where she was found that they believe Lucy made. Now, why do they believe Lucy made those footprints? Well, because they have a high arch and they indicate that it's very human-like and that they would have been made by an upright walking creature. So when they found these footprints, they were looking for some creature that would have made it. Evolutionists were thinking, okay, we evolved from apes. We're looking for an ape that stands up here. Why they didn't just assume it was human, I don't know. But a few years later, they found Lucy, and she was the answer. Her knee showed that she was could have walked upright. Her knee looked kind of human, but they're actually, I told you that her hip was shaped like a human's. That's actually not true. They had a few problems with her hip, and her problem is that her hip actually looks like a chimpanzee, but that doesn't fit the narrative. And so we're going to watch a video here about how they got around that solution. So take a watch here.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Laetoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it. You'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bone seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So, well, I think perhaps the best way to...
All right, so you catch what happened there. Essentially, they're looking at her knee, and they're looking at these footprints, and they're understanding that apes evolved into humans. And so the fact that her hip bone was not shaped correctly was not going to stop them. They had to figure out a way to make that, force that evidence to fit where they needed it to. So if they truly believed that she made these, then they had to find a way to make her hip bone work. And so what he did was say that it was broken, and because it was broken, it had too perfect of a fit, which that alone is hilarious to me, because too perfect a fit usually means that it's a perfect fit for a reason. That was how it was made. However, it was too perfect of a fit because it was stepped on. I don't really understand how that logic works, and then fossilized over. And so what ended up happening was that he cut it with a saw to cut out the parts that didn't fit right. And so then he remanufactured the hip bone so that it matched that of a human hip bone. This is called manufacturing evidence. This is not actually good scientific evidence here. If you were to do this with a court trial and fake evidence to fit your case, it would be thrown out as illegitimate evidence. And this is what they have done. Now, this is a pretty common theme that you're going to find as we go through talking about the apes and humans fossils that they have found here. And so one other thing, they talk about her footprints, but we actually are missing her hands and her feet, which are significant for finding out if she was an ape or a human, because the hands and feet of an ape and human are very distinctly different from each other, because apes are designed for tree climbing, so they have really long rounded fingers and long toes as well for gripping trees. Whereas humans do not. And as we have actually found more of her species fossils, we have found some of the hand bones, and they are indicative of an ape hand, and which means that she likely was a species of ape. And so these fossils were likely an extinct ape that, if they were still alive today, would probably be in a zoo somewhere, because they're just that. They're apes, and probably those footprints were made by something like a human. And then fossilized. So moving on to the next one here, we've got the Piltdown Man. This is a funny one. Piltdown Man was a skull that was found with a jawbone like an ape. Humans and apes have different jaws. They're shaped differently, and so this one had the ape jawbone and the human skull. It was named the Piltdown Man. It was found in England, actually before Lucy ever was, early 1900s, and it was said to be the missing link. This was the proof that man had evolved from an ape. We have a human skull with an ape jaw. These were the drawings of what he must have looked like. Very, very typical caveman. Hugely influenced the area of science around this field of early man. There are 40 years, actually, of research done based on the Piltdown Man, and drawings made, and the public's view of early man was influenced significantly by this. Well, 40 years later, it came out that a scientist was studying it and discovered that, in fact, it had been aged, so it had been painted to look much older than it was. It was actually it was a relatively early, recent skull. And two, and most significantly, the jaw was from an orangutan, and they had removed the jaw of a human and put a orangutan in place, and then aged it and found it, quote unquote, as proof, as evidence. It was a hoax that somebody had pulled on the scientific community, and so they were humiliated, obviously, by this. And but nonetheless, research had been done. They had to rescind a lot of it, but at the same time, the public opinion and the scientific research has been done, and it was influenced in a way that they wouldn't go back entirely. Now, we've got another case here called the Nebraska Man. This was found in Nebraska. And we've got here this picture of what the Nebraska Man would have looked like based on the fossil that we found. Very caveman, very ape-like. This was also said to be a major proof that man had evolved from ape. This was around the same time it was actually used as evidence in the Scopes trial. And anyone want to guess how much of the fossil they found? They found 30% of Lucy's fossil. Well, this one they found much less. In fact, all they found was a tooth. So that picture came from a tooth. That was all that they had to base that entire picture off of. And again, we have this, what we learned in our game. The less evidence you have, the more you have to imagine. Well, that's what they did here. But even funnier still, they kept digging for the fossil and to try and find more of the body because it was such a significant fossil. And the Nebraska Man turned out to be the Nebraska pig. That's right, it was a pig tooth, not a human tooth, and they were humiliated once again and had to rescind all the evidence they had over the past 10, 15 years. And so it was, again, a huge influence on the study, and yet it was wrong. So let's look at some real ones here. Neanderthals, these are real early human skeletons that we find, and this is what scientists think they looked like here. Again, fitting very much with our caveman mentality. These were the cavemen right here. The skulls were very different from human skulls, modern human skulls. And so these are considered to be early ancestors of the apes here, or early human ancestors. One thing significant about them is their jawbone is very large, protruding out, much like an ape. You can see that again here, how it juts out. But then also, if you look, their nasal bone is very large. They had large noses, a lot like monkeys did. And so these were the early humans. One other fact about them is that they were much shorter than modern day humans. And evolutionists are going to say that's because they evolved from apes, and so they slowly gained their height through adaptation over years and years. However, what you will find is that what creationists will theorize is that it's actually because of the cold weather they lived in. And so looking at modern day people, the Inuit people, those are Eskimos. They live in very cold climates. They are very short themselves, and that is in fact one of their adaptations to help keep them warmer. The shorter and squatter your body is, the less distance your heart has to pump the blood, and it stays warmer, and your appendages stay much warmer. It's one of many adaptations that they have. And it's very likely that this was the case with the Neanderthals, because remember, the Neanderthals lived during the Ice Age, and so it would have been very, very cold for them. And so they had to have lived during the Ice Age of time, and so the short bodies would have been very advantageously adapted them to live in cold climates. So now, when we get to some studying of them, some of the more significant research, we've got all these images, but well, there is a guy named Jay Materans who worked fleshing out skulls for FBI. If you watched any of the CSI shows, you've seen him do this, where they put modeling clay over a skull to figure out what the body looked like, what the person looked like before the flesh rotted away. And so we have, he went and did this on some Neanderthal skulls to see what they actually looked like. And this is what he came up with here. This is not our standard caveman here. He looks actually relatively normal. Jay said that he actually had to very intentionally not let his bias to thinking that they were monkeys influence it, because the evidence did not indicate any ape-like features, really. This is what they would have looked like according to his study here. If you actually saw him clean-shaven with hair, walking down the street in a business suit, you wouldn't think twice about seeing this guy. Maybe a little bit short, that's it. So, in addition to that, some of the best research that we have on them is actually from an orthodontist named Jack Cuozzo. And Jack is significant because He was one of the few outsiders that have been allowed to study these bones. Now, very few people, other than the elite evolutionists, are actually even allowed to see Neanderthal skeletons. So few of them are allowed to see it. You have to know the right people and be the right people. So most evidence, and this is rather sketchy to me, but most evidence is found that you in research that you read on these people, these Neanderthals, is based entirely off of photographs and descriptions other people have given, because they're not actually allowed to see the skeletons themselves. So Jack was able to convince his way into to see these things, these skeletons, and he wanted to study their teeth. And so he took a X-rays here, and one of the first things he talks about, and if you you can read his book called Buried Alive or watch some interviews with him on YouTube. One thing he talks about is actually that he witnessed evolutionists sawing with a bone saw again, with the bone saws, sawing the chins off of some of them so that they looked more ape-like to fit this idea that they were ape-like. In addition to that, he also noticed in these x-rays, this is one of the x-rays of the skulls, that the jaws were all out of socket. They were too far forward, pressed forward to look very ape-like. And in fact, the reason he knew this was because when your jaw sits in the correct spot, there's wear and tear pattern on your teeth that shows where your teeth press up against each other. And when they're in the right spot, they fit together kind of like puzzle pieces. It's called occlusion. And this is what you want. You don't want an overbite or an underbite. And so when he put these teeth where they clearly had fit together, the jaw bones popped into place, into socket, which is the exact opposite of what the evolutionary research had showed. They said that they did not fit in place. If the jawbone did not fit in place if you put the teeth in perfect occlusion, so they must have been forward like an ape's jaw. Well, because of his research, they no longer can do this. Very few Neanderthal skeletons actually still show this because they had to change it because he proved them wrong. But his x-rays were actually so controversial that when he gave his copy to the French government, as he was leaving the French government, people tried to break into his hotel and steal them from him so that he couldn't take his x-rays because they messed with the narrative too much. And he actually had to smuggle them out of France in a comic book. And so it was a very uh, a very very something they didn't want to leave the country, this evidence. And so he was able, with these x-rays, actually to get in and study a significant number of Neanderthals all over the world that had been found, and discovered the same thing: the jaws had all been pushed forward to fit this narrative, to fit these artistic drawings that were being done. But also, one thing he noticed is because their jaws are big, and he points out that the human jaw never stops growing with age. So your jaw is always growing just a little bit, and the older you get, the bigger your jaw will get. Same with your nose, in fact. And what is it that is significant about these? Their jaws are very big. Their noses are very big. And if you look in the Old Testament, people used to live a very long time. Methuselah, the longest living man. Let's read Genesis 5:27. How old he was. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. That's a very old person, about almost 1,000 years. Noah lived to be 950 years old. In Genesis 9:29, we read Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. Moses, in Deuteronomy 34:7, we find that he was 120 years old when he died. Still spring chicken. Yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. So Moses actually died early because he had sinned, and God said that he couldn't see the promised land. So God essentially killed him as a punishment for that. And so it even indicates here that he was not unhealthy at 120 years old. So what happens? We have, eventually people slowly start living less and less time the longer that they get away from the flood and from creation. But at the same time, you've got these people that live for a very long time, and so their jaws and their noses are going to grow, and you're going to have skulls and skeletons that look much like this with very large jaws. It's not because they're from apes, it's because they lived to be very, very old, and that fits with the biblical narrative. In addition, remember, they're supposed to be very unintelligent. Well, we find evidence that they had elaborate burials where they buried lots of flowers with the bodies. They also had art. This is supposed to be a lion sculpture. It looks more like a bear to me, but It's supposed to be a lion, and so they did art, they also formed tools and even instruments that we can find. And so they were quite intelligent, and they didn't always live in caves. In fact, we found an evidence that there was a mammoth bone hut that they lived in. It was made entirely out of mammoth bones. This is what it would have looked like when it was together, but here is the actual archaeological dig here, where they dug up all these mammoth bones that the Neanderthals had put together into a hut. Uh, Wild. This is really cool here. But this shows again that they had some architectural skill. They were intelligent. They didn't live in caves. Our ideas of them were very wrong. And uh, so I want to conclude by looking at this verse here. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them." And so I want to look at that and realize that, evolution is looking at all these bones with a narrative in mind, and they're putting together the pieces so that it fits this narrative. We also are looking at it with a narrative. We're looking at it from a scriptural basis. Um, if we truly believe that the Bible is true, then what the Bible says needs to be truth. And so, if the Bible says that man was created in God's image, not in a monkey's image, not evolving, you know, God did not evolve mankind in His own image. He created mankind as we are, male and female. He created us. And so, yes, we are also coming at it from a narrative, but one point is very significant. We have to manipulate the evidence far less, if at all, in order to even have it fit. And oftentimes, science actually ends up catching up with the Bible. And so, if science and the Bible disagree, usually later on, science ends up having to rescind what they said and say something different. What I want you to see from all of this is that your idea of cavemen, of early humans, is heavily influenced by evolution, and that evidence is frankly not there. It has been manipulated. It is not trustworthy. They don't let many people study it. It is very closely guarded. And that should put up some big red flags for you when it comes to the theory of evolution. And so instead, the Bible gives us our answer. The 27th verse of the first chapter of the first book in the Bible, that God created man in His own image. So there you go.